Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now, your host, Jason Bennett.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on the Election University podcast. This is your host, Jason Bennett, and you'll notice from the intro I'm flying solo today. My co-host, Rainey Cohen, is on her honeymoon right now. She went and got herself married a couple weeks ago, and now she's in beautiful Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And so everyone, raise your glasses and give her a little cheers, a little salud to our good buddy, Rainey Cohen, as she celebrates her honeymoon and her recent marriage. I'm really excited about today's episode. It covers a topic that's near and dear to my heart and is a personal interest of mine, cybersecurity. The 2016 election cycle certainly elevated this topic of concern for many of us, and it caused us to think more seriously about how vulnerable or exposed our own sensitive data is, personal or campaign. And while a lot of attention has been focused on Russia, WikiLeaks, and emails, there has not been as much attention spent on what you can do to increase your own security or really assess how vulnerable we all are. So we're going to spend some time in these next two episodes covering cybersecurity. Today's episode will cover your personal security, your campaign security. And in our next episode, we're going to hear from Allie Cole Steele of Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign to discuss election integrity and the hacking of our voting system. So I'm super excited about both of these episodes because we're going to cover a lot of content. This first part of our two-part series on cybersecurity will cover the trends in hacking, what our experts see as on the horizon in terms of recent trends in hacks, and what you can do to lock down your own campaign with simple suggestions and advice on programs that you can use. Our guest today, Benjamin Caudill, is the founder and CEO of Rhino Security Labs. It's a penetration testing firm here in Seattle, Washington. And what's a penetration testing firm? Well, it's a company that basically is hired by other companies that provide apps or software or other systems and tests its vulnerabilities. So it tries to penetrate their security walls that they have built around these systems. And they're hired, they're considered white hat ethical hackers, and they basically expose the vulnerabilities in these programs for companies so that they can fix them and make them more secure. He's a security advisor and researcher, and he's been featured on CNN, Wired, Washington Post, and several other media outlets. His background is information security specialist at Boeing, and he was a penetration tester at US Bank. So he's got lots of experience in identifying and exposing vulnerabilities in various systems. He gained a little notoriety a few years ago when he hacked into an app called Secret, which some of you may be familiar with, but it was very popular in Silicon Valley as it let people anonymously post their deepest, darkest secrets. And if you connected it with your phone list, like your friends list on your phone, you could also see the anonymous secrets of friends in your own social circle. I'm not sure why people would want to do this, but it was very popular and people liked it. And Benjamin was brought on to hack into the system and see if he could expose any weaknesses in their security, in the app security. And sure enough, he was able to create like a bunch of fake bot accounts and basically isolate people's personal information and then link it to their posted secrets. So since this was connected to your phone's friend list, if you had a bunch of fake bot accounts on it and one legitimate email address, you could isolate whoever was posting your friends, anonymous friends posting. If you had their real email address and everything else was fake, you'd get an alert that one of your friends, i.e. the one real account, posted this account. You could isolate this deep secret, right? So he helped them, make the system more secure. He provided, the information around the vulnerability and they made it more secure. So I couldn't think of a better person to help us today and walk our listeners through the steps that they should take to lock down their own personal and campaign security. And Benjamin offers some very simple suggestions in layman's terms to take your campaign security from a level 2, which would be very low level security, probably what most people operate under, not super simple passwords, but not very complex either, and then take it up to a level 8. So very simple suggestions that you can do to basically quadruple your campaign security. And one simple suggestion in particular will triple your security. One task will help triple your security. So It's a lot of great content over these next 2 episodes. I'm really excited to get into it. And so without further ado, let's get into it. Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Before we get started, I'd love to, talk a little bit more about your background. Before we scare everybody, who's listening out there into canceling their internet subscription and moving into the woods, into a tiny little shack, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is actually probably like many people in security is actually unrelated to my formal education. My degree was actually in business and economics, and had been doing this kind of on my own time for quite a while. Had been learning a lot, kind of nights and weekends sort of thing, and got towards the end of college and decided to kind of formalize some of that. So managed to talk my way into a great internship at Boeing and kind of took it from there. So very, again, kind of a standard route, I would say, actually, somewhat surprisingly for security, that not a lot of people have that formal education that you might expect. And it's much more just kind of experience-based.
Right. Great. Can you tell us a little bit about your company and what your work does?
Yes. So Rhino Security Lab. So we are a boutique penetration testing and security assessment company. So what that means for those who aren't familiar with the industry is basically we are trying to identify vulnerabilities in an organization or in a company, very much as an attacker would. So you think of trying to, you think of like ethical hacking, if you've heard that term, very much the same sort of idea where we are trying to penetrate the environment through various vulnerabilities in the network architecture and applications, things like that.
And is it large and small companies? So a mom and pop shop that's concerned about their security would hire your firm, or is this large companies that have complex networking systems and software?
Yeah, typically it's those larger. Generally, it's those larger companies that have more resources, have more data, right? Have more sensitive assets that they're concerned about. But we really focus. Our target market is focused around who has sensitive information. We do work with a lot of startups here in Seattle, in fact, and elsewhere. A lot of small and mid-sized companies, really just anybody that has something they're concerned about losing in some sense. So again, including some political campaigns and government agencies.
So let's talk about Russia in 2016. I think everybody that's listening out there has a concern about its implications for future elections, and particularly around voter integrity and privacy on campaigns. What do you and other folks in this industry, what have you observed? What do you think about what happened during 2016 and these hacks that happened?
Yeah. So what is particularly interesting about this case is there's, for the last several years in a number of different areas, we've seen attacks against government infrastructure and agencies. I was talked about Boeing being on the incident response team there. We saw a lot of these sort of similar attacks. What was interesting about 2016 and this case with Russia was obviously going after a political campaign to influence the election itself. So in this particular case, again, there was a number of different attack vectors or a number of different routes that Russian agents, Russian cyber intelligence had taken to compromise various aspects of the voting system, of the election itself, including compromise within Facebook, within Twitter, to alter social media and kind of alter public perception on certain political issues as well.
And that was the first time that you have seen something like this on that kind of scale?
To this scale, yes. There's been a number of cases where this has happened in, I'll say, more localized instances. Somebody has a vendetta against a particular party, a particular campaign, a candidate, but certainly not to this degree where we've seen significant assets and resources being spent on a national level from one major superpower to another.
Do you think this is still happening?
As it relates to Russia compromising American politics? Yeah,
or this this perception on social media. Do you think that effort is still happening post-election?
It's hard to tell. I mean, even going back and seeing what happened, it's still difficult to pull all the pieces together and kind of fully walk through, we call like digital forensics of this particular incident. There's a number of cases where, in the case of social media, anybody can, to a certain degree, anybody can buy advertisements, and being able to influence users through social media like that is as much part of the infrastructure and what you're buying, so to speak, in social media as it is really an attack. So it's hard to say. This is one of those areas where it's hard to say that it's even happening when it's happening.
So I guess, someone out there is going to be thinking this immediately popped into my head. Could I do something like this on a local level?
In being the attacker?
Yeah, right. Or more appropriately, could my opponent do it?
Sure. In theory, yes. This is also one of those things that, again, going back to that, now that it's really come to light, I think some of those larger tech companies are becoming much more aware of it, and certainly it's reflecting on their image, their reputation as well. So, Facebook and Twitter have both come together and started releasing some information as to what they've seen, and are certainly cracking down on it, I'm sure. Yeah. Again, let me take a step back and say that is somewhat speculation on my part.
Right.
We can't really know how much action is being taken by those major companies, but just given how much it's influenced their reputation and how they've kind of been brought into the negative limelight of what's been happening with Russia, I'd be surprised if they didn't start taking this more seriously themselves.
And do you think that anything is being done on a federal or local level to help prevent this from happening in the future? So are you seeing any steps that are being taken other than the conversation? I think that there's a robust conversation that's happening about this. I would say most of our listeners believe that this happened. There probably are some that don't, but most everyone, I think, is under agreement that this happened. And do you think that there have been appropriate steps, maybe aside from maybe what some of the like Facebook and Google are doing, Twitter are doing to prevent this from happening on that front? Are there things that can be done? Do you see movement happening on a government level?
Well, so specifically on the social media side, I would say nothing significant. I mean, in the sense that you're going at that, I would say any major change has to start with education, and this is a big wake up call. This is definitely getting a lot of people's attention. So certainly, and shows like this conversation in itself is a huge step forward in just educating the public, educating candidates and those in politics that this is a serious issue, that real influence and real compromise can happen from attacks like this, and being able to kind of leverage that or even parlay that into future discussions and future action, hopefully, is kind of the direction that we need to start.
So I went to DEF CON this year, and they had basically a learning village of voting machines, and they were able to hack them in 15 minutes.
Right.
And I think one of the goals is to have folks who do this white ethical hacking work like that you do, raise these vulnerabilities, not even just the social media, influencing public opinion in that respect, but actually going after things like voting machines, people's emails, the WikiLeaks component, and identifying the vulnerabilities and sealing them up. Are you seeing that level of awareness and education? Are we reaching a level where this could have as significant an impact as it did?
This is kind of one of those nuances or I would say subtleties maybe of the cybersecurity industry that really kind of is not well covered, I think, is that a lot of and we see this ourselves as well, any sort of new vulnerabilities that come out and are identified are one, very, very slow to get fixed. In cases like this, I know for a fact, actually, a number of major voting machine vendors, suppliers have been very, very slow and even resistant to fixing known vulnerabilities. And then even when the vulnerability is available, the patch is available to fix that issue, actually getting that implemented in those various environments is a whole separate challenge. So what we actually see happen in the environment is what we'll call it like day one. We call it like 0 day. Day one, it is patched or is made available. And it can be anywhere from six months to 6 years before it's actually patched and that issue is resolved. So it's a pretty significant timeline when you consider how long an attacker has to exploit that particular vulnerability. And to a certain degree, that's actually what happened with Equifax as well. That breach in that case was a known flaw.
Well, let's move into the education part of this. What do you think the top mistakes or myths are around, individual security? Small businesses, nonprofits, individuals, folks that don't have large IT budgets. What mistakes are they making in regards to their own security?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned education. I would say that's probably the biggest aspect in itself. And there's really two. You mentioned 5. I have 2 right off the top of my head. The first one, first and foremost, is the idea that I, small business owner, individual, whoever that is, small organization, nonprofit, I have nothing that an attacker wants. Right? I'm not a target because I don't have social security numbers, credit card numbers, PHI, whatever that is. For some reason, a person or an organization thinks that they won't be a target and that they therefore don't have to worry about security, right? That in itself is the biggest myth that we are constantly trying to break down and trying to make clear is that it is very easy for an attacker to utilize to profit from just having malware on your system, right? At the point where I get malware onto your system, I can now send spam emails. I can, attack other systems. I can host illicit content for other people to download from your system. There's a number of different ways, dozens of different ways for an attacker to monetize an otherwise useless or insecure system without having to actually steal anything from you.
Let's break that down just a little bit, if you don't mind, because I think that's the number one thing that I hear when I harp on this with clients is that I'm not Hillary Clinton. That level of spotlight, that that level of power is not relatable to me. I am very low level. What do hackers want? I mean, putting malware on your computer and allowing spamming and whatnot to happen. What else do hackers want from anybody's computer who isn't John Podesta or Hillary Clinton?
Sure. Yeah. So like I said, I mean, the biggest one is just being able to use your system for other attacks, whether that is sending out malicious emails to everybody on your contacts list, which if anybody was following, there was a major kind of Gmail worm or outbreak several months back. And that was essentially what that infection was. Users were opening a malicious email essentially and essentially accepting some malware or running some malware. And as part of that, it was going into all of your contacts and sending all of your contacts this same email. And it was very successful. Got a huge, call it a botnet or like a group of zombie computers very, very quickly through that. So that's one case, just being able to leverage your system for additional attacks, email phishing and things like that. Another one is, again, being able to essentially lock out your system or lock you out of your system through what we call like ransomware, essentially just encrypting all of your files. It doesn't necessarily need to be social security numbers or Hillary Clinton's laptop. Right. This can be your family photos, right? Anything that you think is valuable, anything that you think is worth having, is very likely on your system, on your laptop, and is images, spreadsheets, PDFs. And if I, a bad guy, go and encrypt all that and say, you have to give me, X $100, X $1,000 to get your files back. That's another way that attackers are very quickly monetizing access to your system.
My partner, Mike, who does this work, had mentioned that another thing that he's seeing in particular is prescriptions, that people are attacking medical records, getting into people's computers, seeing, medical records, or attacking doctor or dentist offices and getting medical records, and then getting prescriptions filled off of those medical records. Yeah. It seems that there's just a wide berth of activity that could happen, that these hackers can become profitable off of, anything. You don't have to be Hillary Clinton. You can make them money through your own vulnerabilities in your computer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
What new threats are you seeing on the horizon? Are you seeing anything new that's coming down the pike that people should be aware of?
I would say probably more than anything, it's a lot of, I mean, security is as frustrating as it is sometimes. There's a lot of new techniques to enable or to further facilitate the same attacks that we've been seeing. I mentioned, email attacks and spam and things like that. I mean, we were seeing that back in 1980, 1990, and we're still seeing it today, just kind of leveraged in different ways. So as much as there's new types of attacks and new approaches to it, the basic constructs from an attacker standpoint are all about the same. It's just a matter of, again, utilizing those new technologies to do the same old tricks. Mm-hmm. That's a big one, as I mentioned. Email attacks and spam and so forth. Another one, again, is malware, being able to just run malicious code on your system, whether that's ransomware and I'm locking you out, or I'm sending spam from your system, or I'm leveraging that and uploading malicious documents or other illicit material and hosting it on your system. There's a lot of different things that you can do with that, and it's from a user standpoint, the types of malware aren't necessarily relevant, but just again, being able to mitigate that or being able to prevent against that is the more concerning or the more pressing issue.
Can you ever make yourself 100% hack proof?
We can always raise the fence, so to speak. We can take additional measures to protect ourselves and to add extra layers of defense. But there's no there is no magic bullet, so to speak. There's always somebody who needs to interact with the system legitimately, to interact with your data, with your database, with voter information, other things. So there's always those aspects that need to be leveraged, and in that system, whatever that looks like, there's always some vulnerability. It's just a matter of how easy that is to exploit.
Let's talk about some of the tools that you would recommend for folks, knowing that these are small, for lack of a better term, small businesses, right?
Sure.
Without huge budgets. Very few of them will have IT departments or people dedicated to IT within their firms. Maybe there are some apps or tools that folks can use. I'll give you some areas that would be particularly vulnerable, and you can tell me what you think about various tools and maybe some software that people could download that are low cost that you think help build some of that wall between you and the hackers. So websites in particular. I think most campaigns have, down ballot races use WordPress. It's freely available. It's easily customizable. It's fairly simple. And it's your broad-based, content management system. Mm-hmm. Are there plugins or vulnerabilities that people should be aware of when they're dealing with WordPress that you're aware of?
WordPress. I mean, so WordFence is actually a good place to start. That'll handle a lot of the low-hanging fruit from a security perspective and be able to mitigate, again, a lot of those basic attacks against your website. So that's a great place to start.
Great. And then for folks who aren't using WordPress and they have maybe customized websites or templates that are offered from GoDaddy or some sort of online hosting company, do you have recommendations or questions that maybe they should ask their hosting company as it relates to security and whatever sort of spam software that they're included in their email systems?
Yeah. So actually, both of these kind of relate to a common thread, I would say, where one of my other recommendations was going to be two-factor authentication, which is basically a way of proving you are who you say you are, right? And typically we do that through a username and password, right? Or email and password, something like that. And a second factor, a two-factor authentication mechanism, is basically an additional step that you have to take. And typically this is like a text message code that's sent to your phone that you have to type in, or some other case, a device or an app that you have on your phone. Google has that, for example, Google Authenticator. Some other mechanism that you have to leverage and prove you are who you say you are. So if I steal your credentials, steal your password somehow, I steal your password and try to log in as you in Google, I would still need then your phone to be able to prove that I am you and therefore get access to your account. Right. So it's a relatively easy step to implement this. And this is actually a pretty common today. Fortunately, it's a pretty common mechanism in a lot of applications. And WordPress has plugins that allow for two-factor, as well as as well as GoDaddy and other popular websites as well. This isn't something that is universal. Unfortunately, there are sites that do not support two-factor at all. But this would be definitely one of the questions that I would be asking your hosting provider, whoever is handling your website, is how do I enable two-factor authentication on my account?
Great. So WordFence and two-factor authentication, we'll include all this stuff in the show notes for sure. And we'll also have a downloadable ebook that folks can download after this episode as well for any details on what they can do as well. We talked a little bit about emails. Is Gmail secure? Do folks have a level of, in your business, have a level of confidence in the security of Gmail?
Generally, yeah. I would say Gmail itself is not a bad platform from a security perspective. We use it ourselves, actually. Mm-hmm. It's more about the implementation. Again, I go back to two-factor authentication. It's more about the authentication into that account or into that system, as well as your password itself. I mean, that's another major component. And another recommendation, I would kind of jumping ahead. Another recommendation is having a password manager. So KeePass or LastPass or something like that, essentially just allowing for a single encrypted database where you store all your passwords for your accounts. And they are so you don't have to remember them. Makes it easier on you, right? That's simpler. And at the same time, and this is really from a security perspective, the important part, you're not having to use the same password over and over, which is a terrible security sin, or even worse, having very simple, easy to guess passwords.
Right. I use LastPass, and one of the nice features about LastPass is that it will remind you to change your passwords, and for very common websites, it'll automatically do it with a click of a button. It'll update it automatically, which is really nice. What about like Google apps, like Google Drive, for example, where everybody's putting their stuff in the cloud, documents and private information, photos, everything's going in the cloud. How do you feel about using Google Drive as a document sharer?
Yeah, again, this is one where I say, in really encouraging and enforcing that two-factor authentication for, again, yourself, and in the case where you do have a small business, for all of the other members of the team, all the other members of the organization, ensuring that everybody's using that same level of security for their account. They're using strong passwords. Those basics are being established. At the point where you just adhere to some of those basic hygiene, those basic security principles, it's not a bad platform. Again, Google has done some really good work in making that simple and easy to use. And as you mentioned, it's a solid platform from a functionality standpoint. But the security of it is pretty good as well. Absolutely.
One of the things that I noticed about it, and maybe I don't have the right settings on it, is if you download it on your laptop and you have yourself logged in all the time, which you would unless you forcibly log yourself out of Google Drive.
Sure.
And you lose your laptop or it gets stolen, anybody can access those documents. There's no way to add a level of login automatically into it. You have to like forcibly log out and log in.
Correct. You're absolutely right. And it's certainly a big concern. This is one of those where I would say the alternative, I would say, is just having things locally on your laptop, right, versus on Google Drive. And this is actually another tool that I would recommend. Another capability is full disk encryption. Is basically a software program that if I steal your laptop, for example, and I pull the thing apart and pull out the hard drive, where the files are stored and everything, if I plug that into a hard drive reader, essentially, I would be able to read everything on it. I wouldn't need to log into Windows. I wouldn't need your password by default. I wouldn't need any of that access because it is unencrypted. The hard drive is in clear text, we would say. So full disk encryption, again, kind of obviously the opposite side of this, is essentially encrypting everything that happens on the laptop, and it's pretty transparent. You enter a password as you log in before Windows boots. Enter a password, and everything else is transparent and essentially prevents exactly that attack.
And how much does that cost?
This is actually this is a free product.
Oh, full disk encryption is free?
Yeah, there's a number of products that offer it out there, but a number of these are actually free and open source applications, very well tested from a security standpoint, and very well known.
Great.
Yeah, Veracrypt is the one that I'm thinking of.
Veracrypt. I hadn't heard of that. I like it. Internet of Things. What is it? Why is it scary?
Internet of Things. So IoT devices are essentially the ability for a small computer to be in just about anything. I was just talking to somebody. I mean, very often you hear internet connected light bulbs or other appliances that are connected to the internet.
Alexa, Google Home.
Yeah, exactly. Things that you talk to, things that you use. I was just hearing about an internet-connected, Bluetooth-enabled toothbrush that you use. This toothbrush, and it has all these sensors in it, and then it connects to your phone and stores all this data in the cloud. And now you can see analytics of your hygiene, right? And things again, just using the sensors on the device. So. Yeah, so IoT is a very broad subject, and I mean, to a degree, I would say like any of the new smart cars that are coming out that have sensors, that have capabilities that are connected to the internet, similar IoT devices. So this is a scary concept. This is a scary world from a security perspective, because there's typically so few security protections built into those applications. We're kind of really early in that industry, that space, and all of the focus is on the engineering and just doing newer, crazier things with IoT devices, smaller chips and new sensors, and the Alexa on your desk and everything else. It's all about getting something new to market, and that's the concern from the manufacturing standpoint, the developer standpoint. And there's not a whole lot of emphasis yet. Not a whole lot of emphasis spent on security and making sure that these devices are able to withstand attacks.
Laptops and desktop security. Are there software programs that you would recommend folks download to use to help prevent malware?
Yeah. So again, this is another one. The basics go a long ways. Having an antivirus program on your system is a good place to start. Again, certainly as you have more security needs and more sensitive information or sensitive assets, taking additional steps beyond that is certainly advised. But
what would be the next step beyond that you would recommend?
Sure. So one of those that I would say for, again, depending on what you're specifically concerned about, I would say is actually application whitelisting. So this is this gets a little technical pretty quick, but this is kind of almost the inverse of malware, the inverse of antivirus, where an antivirus program, which would essentially relies on a blacklist, that I know that these things are malicious, and therefore I'm going to block these things. An antivirus, a whitelisting application would only allow these trusted applications to run, and is much more restrictive and much more is able to secure an environment, a computer, much better, because it essentially assumes that everything is malicious except those things that it already knows are trusted.
So you'd recommend that more in local governments or state government systems, right? When someone gets elected to office, they should be whitelisting applications, rather than relying on malware.
Right. Yeah.
That makes sense. VPNs, what are they? We're hearing a lot about them recently. So what are they in layman's terms and laywomen's terms, and what should people be buying them?
Sure. So a VPN is essentially an encrypted tunnel between two endpoints. So typically this is you being one of those endpoints. You have this on your laptop or your mobile device for that matter, and you are providing an encrypted tunnel between yourself and some other network. So sometimes this is for secure access, say to a local office or your headquarters, right? I'm going to be working from a coffee shop today, and I need access to the resources in the office. I would access those through this encrypted tunnel, through this encrypted connection. So it's a way of providing all of the resources of an environment or a network from remotely in a secure way, essentially.
So if you're at a coffee shop and you're working on their Wi-Fi, it's going to add a layer of security to your connection, almost a mandatory level of security that you should expect when you're using public Wi-Fi, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And you can use these for your phones as well as laptops and desktops.
Yeah, it's more popular for laptops, desktops. I should say laptops, specifically because mobile. I mean, it does add some, I'll say, overhead to the bandwidth. It's a little heavier if you're using your mobile device, but yes, it can certainly be used on any device that you can have internet on.
Great. And then, speaking of phones, wanted
Sure.
to end on recommendations for phones, because I think that's a huge vulnerability for folks, their mobile devices, and that's your area of expertise is, assessing risk on mobile applications and whatnot. So what are your recommended tools to increase security on mobile devices?
Yeah, so I would say this is another one where I would go back to authentication and passwords, and how do you get access to that data, right? I'll say a large majority of the time you have an account tied to, outside of your mobile device, an account tied to that data, to that information, whether that is on Apple's side, the iOS side, or Google and Android. You have a separate account tied to that, and being able to keep that device or keep that account secure is very, very, very important. So again, I go back to the basics of have a password manager, use strong passwords, have two-factor authentication, so that if that password does get stolen, does get hacked somewhere, you still keep yourself secure. It's kind of an easy insurance policy, and keeping those basics up to par. As far as additional protections, again, I would go back very, very similar to what I mentioned with laptops, is full disk encryption. This is actually standard on iOS devices, and I think it's optional on Android. But again, ensuring that if I steal your phone, which people lose their mobile devices, you have them stolen all the time. That's obviously not uncommon. At the point where that does happen, sooner or later, how does an attacker, or can an attacker actually get access to the underlying data? That's another one that we see as a major problem all the time. Whether it's city officials, small business, large business, somebody loses a mobile device, and a hacker gets their hands on it somehow and is able to extract passwords or compromising photos or contacts list.
Right.
It's data is gold.
So do screen protector, password screen protectors or motion, making the finger swipe motions, retina scans, fingerprint sensors, are those an additional layer of security that you think are helpful, or do you think that that's just fake peace of mind, false sense of security? Sure.
There's always a trade-off, I'll say, between usability and security. And this is another one to kind of keep in mind, is that you can always get more secure, but that will likely make it harder to use in many cases. So this is one of those cases where there was a little bit of a sacrifice of security for the benefit of usability, right? I don't have to remember my password every time I use my phone because I have a thumbprint, and my thumbprint authenticates me. It knows who I am based on that. But again, I say it goes back to sacrificing a little bit of security when you do that, because it's been shown that you can essentially duplicate a thumbprint, a fingerprint, and be able to fake that thumbprint, that person's real identity. In many cases, it's much easier to do that than it is to identify what your password was, or somehow steal your password, film you doing that or something like that. So it's not a perfect solution. It does make it much easier to access your phone, and certainly it's better than a very weak password. But there are better options out there.
The new iPhones are doing face retinal reads, right? And
sure, right.
All of that stuff just freaks me out generally, thinking about putting my retinal scan into a database that Apple then owns.
Right.
Or my fingerprint for that matter.
Sure.
But I've heard that that's a reaction to this fingerprint vulnerability that you're talking about, that it's easy to replicate a copy of it, and that even the recognition software has some margin of error in it as well.
Right.
Some false matches, I guess, or
in this case, the jury's, I would say, a little bit still out on, at least at this point, the jury's still out on the Apple's implementation of the face scanner. There's been a couple of implementations of this already that have come out previously that have been, again, nice in theory and secure in theory, and has been very easy to trick. I basically show a picture of you to the camera, and that was in many cases as simple as it gets for being able to defeat that system. Apple claims to have more advanced analytics or advanced capabilities to identify you as a person versus you as a picture, and some ways to identify attacks like that. But again, we'll see how that shakes out when that's released, and attackers have their way with it.
Right. Signal versus WhatsApp versus the native texting application of a person's phone. Do you have recommendations or advice on those?
Generally, again, I would say generally avoid traditional text message through the native app of either iOS or Android. Really more for the privacy of where that data lives, I'll say. Anytime you use, and again, I'm kind of speaking on both platforms right now. Anytime you have that data, you send a text message, you receive a text message that is also stored in the cloud in either the Google database or iOS and Apple. And so anytime you get a new phone, all your text messages, your conversations are there, which is, again, great. But that means that if I, an attacker, somehow get access to your account and manage to download those messages or associate my phone with your account, I now have access to all of your conversations, all of your photos, all of those things that you have, again, associated with that cloud account, that mobile account. This is actually one of the specific benefits to using something like Signal, is that I get a new phone, I switch devices or lose it. That doesn't transfer with me, and it's encrypted on the phone itself. So there's a number of benefits to using something like that over a kind of traditional or standard SMS or text message application.
So Signal only works at its best, right? Its full potential, its full security, if both users are using it, correct? Because what would be the challenge is the end-to-end encryption, right? The message that I sent is then encrypted, and then it hits you, and it's encrypted when it's in your phone.
Right.
So that end-to-end encryption is important. So if I'm only using Signal and the recipient of my text is not using it, it's less secure. It's still secure from my sending standpoint.
Sure.
If my phone gets hacked or stolen or lost, but not if theirs.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So then what about WhatsApp? When both users are using WhatsApp, how secure is that?
It's better than nothing. It's better than text message, I would say. It's somewhere between those two poles. Again, one of those that has obviously become very, very popular in the last many years. But they only recently started implementing a number of the security protections, the encryption protections even, that a lot of us in the security community were waiting to happen for some time. And that in itself, I mean, it's better late than never. But that, at least personally, makes me a little less confident in their real dedication to security and to users' privacy than some of those other applications like Signal, which have been pretty much based on a basis or a standard of privacy and security pretty much from its inception. So,
knowing, we gave some great recommendations on some free or very low cost tools that folks could use on a local low budget campaign to make themselves a little bit more secure. Rough estimate, how much more secure is somebody after applying some of these tools than before? I think folks will want to be able to quantify a level of security. You can even rate it on a orange to green system,
Sure.
Orange being the high alert. And, what level of security do you think this provides people?
Yeah, so going through a couple of those tools that I mentioned, so like two-factor authentication, having strong passwords, having a password manager, removing some of those weak or reused passwords and so forth, antivirus and full disk encryption even. I would say kind of a 1 to 10 scale, and again, kind of keeping in mind a lot of my role and our role in security is kind of playing the role of the attacker and trying to hack organizations to help them better themselves and better their organization's security. I would say if you don't have any of those things, scale of 1 to 10, how difficult it would be for me to hack you would be maybe a 2 or 3 in terms of difficulties. Very easy. Probably something I could do in an afternoon. Probably maybe even in an hour or a couple hours. Implementing all of those things, just those things that I've mentioned. Again, very, very simple, very, very cheap. Now it goes up to a 6, 7, 8. Real quick. There's some very, very easy gains from a security perspective that you can make, again, in the course of an afternoon.
That's a significant increase.
Yeah.
For some very simple tools. Is it fair to say then that person has to be really targeted? That has to be in someone's sites in order for them to get in after applying some of these tools?
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is going back to what you said. There's no such thing as being bulletproof, being hack proof. Right. So this is not to say, this is certainly not a guarantee, but it does mean that the basic attacks, the basic things that you see, compromising email and things like that, or even again the Hillary Clinton email, if they would have implemented two-factor authentication, not to say that would have never happened, but it would have been certainly harder for the attacker to do that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for that. If you wanted folks to learn more about your work and maybe some of the services that you offer, where can they go and what could they access you if they wanted to get some of your assistance on some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, as I mentioned, we work with a number of organizations from small, mid-sized companies to larger enterprises. For more information and details on what we do, our website is rhinosecurity.labs.com. Again, a lot of that will have information on kind of how we go about those security assessments, how we walk through those penetration tests, and kind of help you identify where some of those deeper security vulnerabilities might lie.
That's great. And we'll have that again in the show notes. We'll make sure to include the web address on there and a brief summary of that. On a final note, if you could write any legislation at all to deal with this particular issue, what would you write? This is your opportunity to pitch to future elected officials and current elected officials, staff, anybody that's involved in politics is listening. So what would you ask them to do?
I would require anybody that is publishing any software or publishing any sort of IT product, IT service, have even an absolute baseline set of security practices and standards that they need to adhere to.
Great. Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us today. This was great.
Thank you so much.
And that is a wrap. Thank you, Benjamin Caudill, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help us today and walk us through some very simple steps that people can take to increase their security and to lock down their campaign. That's Benjamin Caudill of Rhino Security Labs, rhinosecuritylabs.com. Again, thank you so much, Benjamin. And again, we'll have in the show notes for you today The link to that free ebook that we were mentioning, the 15 steps to lock down your campaign, ways to increase your own security to help prevent hacking into your campaign, whether it's Russia or North Korea or your opponent, just some very simple steps that you can take to increase your security. We will probably do a follow-up part 2 to this conversation as hacking is constantly evolving and the techniques are always changing. And I'm sure that there are going to be other things that we're going to need to address in the future. So please continue to listen. This is definitely an interest in something that I care about passionately, want to make sure that we keep our campaigns as safe and secure as possible. So thanks for tuning in today. If you want to zip on over to iTunes, we'd really appreciate it. Love to get those ratings and any feedback that you have. If you have a suggestion for a particular topic or a guest for our episode, send us an email, podcast@electionu.com. Again, on behalf of Rainey Cohen, who is on her sunny honeymoon, and myself, Jason Bennett, your host, thank you so much for listening. Have a great one.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.